Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about middle childhood. So just to open this up, again, the book generally frames this along the stages of Erickson's stages. So the first couple chapters that we covered, we looked at infancy, and then we look at toddlers, and then we looked at early childhood, and now we're making our way into middle childhood. I usually think of middle childhood around 6 or 7 to about age 12 or the onset of puberty. This is definitely when children are at their most, what's the best way to put it? Sweet, kind, observant, constantly listening. I don't know. I don't know if that's accurate or not. But something about this time, and I think it's because they start to gain that social awareness. They start being aware of their peers. They start to really care about what other people think of them. They become aware of authority during this time. So again, it's an interesting time, middle childhood. Um, but again, for Erickson's stages, so trust versus mistrust, again, do you have that security with your caregivers or do you not? Again, that is the infancy stage. Then we kind of get into toddlers. Are they able to kind of go out in the world and be creative on their own, or are they really hesitant and shy? And then initiative versus guilt. Are they like beginning to, get involved in things and learn new tasks? Are they struggling to cope? And then in this chapter, we're going to be looking at industry versus inferiority. And this is when they really go out and they start to develop their cognitive, emotional, and social abilities. But they also become very aware of who they are as people, in the sense that they start to think about how do other people feel about them. And again, if you look at the hierarchies of kids in schools at this age, which the book talks about, they become aware of, which kids they like to hang out with and who the cool kids are and things like that. And you have to wonder how much that's built into biology and how much that's just been socialized. But again, this idea that even at this stage, people develop a preference for the people they're hanging out with, the type of people, a lot of this is built into our genetics, so how much of your genes are attracted to certain friends and certain types of personalities and things along those lines is a really interesting question. And then how much of your friend choices is based upon the social context for again. But again, just to phrase it, we have our critiques and stages, but there are just these general, developmental milestones that, we could say that children go through. Again, the ability to go beyond your parents and start to explore the social world and start to learn these tasks and start to develop these skills and have our brain developing and our vocabularies developing and our ability to use logic. And then around, even at this time, kids learn to be able to use abstract thought. They, which is, relatively new, but it takes a certain amount of physical brain development just to be able to do abstract thought. And so this is about that time when kids can kind of step outside of the box a little bit and, kind of tell when you're tricking them, for example. They're a little bit less gullible, for example. But again, that's because our brains are developing at this age so much. And they're becoming little people. You definitely start to see the solidification of gender and personality at this time, temperament, emotional well-being. So much solidifies at this age. The book opens it up with the classic play. Most of us forget that play serves several purposes, and play is built into our genes. You have to ask, why do so many species play? Dolphins will take anaconda snakes and play catch with an anaconda snake. Why is it built into dolphins to play? So a lot of play has to do with group behavior. Again, it's built into us to work into groups for our survival. We are not solitary creatures in our DNA. We seek out people, we seek out relationships for various reasons. But again, if you just apply evolutionary psychology, how does working in groups help us survive? So a lot of play is a chance to go out and interact in the social world and to be able to develop these skills, not only your own personal skills and be able to try out stuff, and then your emotions when it comes to dealing with life as human and also dealing with life interacting with other humans. But again, those social skills, what kind of level can you interact with other people? Can you get people to like you? Why do we even care about people liking us? Again, that's built into our DNA. We care about people liking us because we want to be accepted by the group, because it's built into our DNA to work with the group. And so if we're accepted by the group, that it increases our chances of survival. So again, that theory of mind that you can put yourself in somebody else's shoes, that has developed for a reason. And again, it's to help us to survive, help us to interact with other people, for example. But play is a very busy and industrious time for children between ages 6 and 12. They're at that pretend play stage, but you can kind of tell by about 6, 7, 8, 9 years old that they're really starting to work their way kind of out of the pretend stage and kind of applying that pretend stage more to games. But this is a time where kids use play to, one, model, imitate the roles of other people. They use play to learn how to use objects. They use play to develop their skills. The book describes it as a time when they're doing, planning, playing, getting together with friends, and achieving tasks. So this is an interesting time where the children are very active. It's a time where they're gaining a sense of how they measure up compared with other peers. Again, while kids are out interacting with other people, they're becoming aware of how other people feel about them, and they're looking at their skills versus other people's skills. And, is that kind of sense of competition built into us, that we competing with our peers at this time? And that's an interesting question that the book addresses. We'll get into here in a minute. Again, the stage of industry versus inferiority, kids begin to measure themselves and how successful they are at school, at their art, at their sports, or whatever activities that they're engaging in. They just start to care. And why do we care? Again, it's that biopsychosocial approach. How much of our motivation to do art and learn skills is built into our biology? How much of it has to do with just the way we think and our interests and our passions and our feelings and our emotions and our attachments to certain things that we're doing? And then how much of it is the social context and how that structures our behavior and guides us toward learning, like going to school and doing tasks and putting us in situations where we have to interact with other people. Play plays a huge role in emotional, intellectual, and social development. Again, as we've been discussing, by interacting with other people, you have to deal with the emotions of that. You have to learn your own emotions and how to manage your own emotions in order to work with other people. You have the cognitive development where you're going out in the social context and you're trying out skills, you're learning new things. And then your social development, again, interacting with people in the social context and learning how to use language, symbolic language to interact and find agency in the social context. And then there's pretend play. Again, our ability to use symbolic thought, sociodramatic play, to be able to play out roles, whether it's with ourselves or whether it's with other people, is maybe a uniquely human phenomena. How is it that we can just engage in something that's not necessarily real, that we can use our, what you call, imagination? And again, I always ask, why did the imagination develop over time? What does the imagination do for us? But again, it enables us to play out things that could happen in the future, to role play potential activities. Again, as you're a kid, you role play being a police officer, but then one day you step into those shoes. And so again, how much does role playing as a police officer prepare you to actually take the role of a police officer is a really good question. And so again, if you kind of look at the purpose of play and why it's built into us, a lot of it's that personal individual development, a lot of it's the social context development and learning to work with other people. And so why has it developed for many years is a really good question. And your book also talks about sports at this age, that academics, it improves academics, physical and emotional development, and also satisfaction with family and quality of life. But again, what the book doesn't discuss when it comes to sports and play like that is that, is there a mental toll? Does it impose stress? Something I've thought about over the years is, you would assume that athletes are so much happier because they're in such better shape. But again, that stress from having to go to school and having to do sports and things along those lines can cause some psychological distress. Your book did break it down into types of play for preschool children, for example. Unoccupied play, children's behavior is more random without a specific goal. Solitary play, hanging out with themselves, not engaging with other people. Onlooker play while you're observing people playing. Parallel play, playing alongside each other but not with each other directly. Associative play, interacting with each other and sharing but not necessarily working toward a common goal. And then cooperative play, where they're interacting to achieve a common goal. And during middle childhood is when you really see the rules start to come out. Again, kids get really good at the cooperative play. And again, that's built into our group behavior. It's us who, interacting in the social context are the ones who create the rules. Of course, these are arbitrary rules, but just watch kids at play. They spend more time making the rules about the game than they ever do playing the actual game. But again, why is it that they're trying to learn this task? Why do they spend so much time learning to cooperate with each other to achieve goals? And so again, it's built into us at that time that we become very peer focused. Again, we've hit that point where we're past 5, we're hopefully moving on, where we don't have to be so attached to our parents all the time. We're becoming more peer oriented. We're becoming aware of our own role in the social context. We're thinking about how other people feel about us. We care how other people feel about us. We're seeking out friends. Why does this happen at this stage? And again, how much of it's evolution? Why are kids at this stage needing to learn to cooperate? Is it to set them up for the future, that when they become adults and get into puberty and onward, that they have to do this in order to survive? And so again, I like to always apply those biological arguments, for why is play built in with us? Why is cooperative play built into us? Why do kids spend so much time making rules? How much that's built into your genetics? Are we driven to interact with other people and then use symbolic language to figure out how to work with those other people, to cooperate with those other people? These are the things we should be thinking about all the time. Again, but at this stage, middle childhood, friendships and peer relationships just become exceptionally important. Again, up until now, we've had the immediate family, and the extended family and our sibling relationships. But it's at this time where the children are starting to go off on their own. Past about age 5, those kids can start to survive in the wild a little bit. I mean, if they really had to, if you look at Lord of the Flies or something like that. But there's some good arguments there that by about age 5, kids, can they start to survive on their own, is a really interesting question. Is that why they start to go out and form more relationship with peers to be able to work better in the wild and in the social environment? But again, it becomes very important at this time. The book defines friendships and peer relationships as voluntary associations characterized by some degree of similarity and affiliation. And so again, distance is usually the #1 thing associated with how you make friends and the people you're interacting with. But again, we seek out people in our proximal zone here to go hang out with. Who you end up marrying usually lives 5 miles from your house, for example. But by about age 4, children start to use the word friend, and they start to think of who are my friends, and they start to categorize those friends. Why? Why is it important that at 4, all of a sudden we're classifying our friend groups? Because again, we want to know who our support is. We want to know who our people are. It's built into us. Our friendships influence. So not only do you have primary socialization from your parents and your peer, your siblings and stuff, but you also have that from your friends. At this age, your friends start to influence you, not just the information and the culture you're being socialized into, but also your personality too. They're structuring your behavior. They're structuring the rules for what's right and wrong and what's appropriate when you're hanging out with each other and things along those lines. The book breaks it down into conceptions of friendship. You have the reward cost friends, where what are you getting from the situation? Normative expectations, where you guys have this basic set of rules or cultural standards about friendships that you follow. And we're having an empathetic and understanding relationship where you guys are, interacting and truly caring about each other. Then you have the book breaking it down into peer group statuses. And again, when I was reading this, I wondered about it because again, like, how cruel is it that your book is busting out like popularity and clicks already by like 6 years old? But again, is that built into us? Do we naturally classify people into these, the book uses the word sociometric assessment. Again, do we assess our peers and then categorize them? And the book gave a bunch of categories, like the popular kids, the rejected kids, the controversial kids that some people love, some people hate, the neglected one that no one really chooses, and then the average one that sometimes gets chosen, sometimes doesn't. And it just got me wondering, because, but is that really how we break down our friendships? Is it that similar? Is that simple? Can we just have like 5 categories and that works? But again, think about it. Do you have best friends? Do you have like secondary best friends? Do you have acquaintances? Are there just people that you just talk to at school, but you don't have any interest later on? Are there people that nobody talks to, that nobody listens to? Are there kids that are left out? And then you start to wonder about all kinds of sociological interactions. Like, why is that kid being left out? Why is there a rejected kid? Why are not all the kids the popular kids? What's up? Why do we even care about popularity in the first place? What's going on? But again, is a status hierarchy built into us? That's another conversation for another day. But likability is associated with quality of life. And again, it goes back to, why do we want to be liked? What benefit does that serve us? Survival of the fittest, evolutionary psychology kind of thing. But again, being liked means being accepted by the group, means getting that support and benefit. If you are not liked and they reject you, you're out of the group. And so how much of kids play in these peer relationships that are so important is the means by which kids learn to become likable so that they can follow the cultural norms so that people will want to hang out with them. And again, I'm a sociology professor also. Challenging cultural norms is imperative. Otherwise we never would have females as doctors. You never have a Black person as a president. But again, we all conform to the cultural norms. We do that so that we will be accepted by the group. If you deviate from the cultural norms, then that challenges the dynamics of the group sometimes. And so again, why do we conform? Why do we want to go out and learn the rules? Why do we even care? And again, so much of that has to do with our basic need to be accepted by the group, for example. So it's all built into us to be liked. And so we engage in impression management, for example, trying to give positive impressions of ourselves to other people because we want them to like us, but also through the looking glass self, how we feel about ourselves is based upon how we think other people feel about us. And so at middle childhood, kids become very aware, that theory of mind, of how other people feel about them. And again, they start to measure themselves compared to other people. And then that influences all the self-psychology, self-esteem, self-worth, competency, efficacy. And so, again, how do we help all kids develop that self-worth, that self-esteem? How do we help them be liked by themselves and by others to have that happy quality of life is, a good challenge. Regarding cognitive development, we had, the stages here of Kohlberg's or the Piaget's stages here for cognitive development, forgive me. So we have pre-operational, the concrete operational of cognitive development. So again, pre-operational means that they don't have that abstract thinking and they're not skilled in logic. And it really takes till the kid's about 6, 7 years old to really start to develop this concrete operational thinking, the ability to use logic in concrete ways. Again, looking at cause and effect, looking at size differences, reversibility, conservation, distance. At this age, they haven't developed what you call the deductive reasoning, looking like top down from big to small. But about middle childhood is when they start to really get good at inductive reasoning, again, going from the small to the big. Again, addition, subtraction, a little bit of division, things like that. But you're not ready to break it down from like the macros cosmic, universal perspective and bring it down just yet. But about 6 to 12, they can start to focus on these multiple dimensions. They no longer are limited by centration. This or part whole classification, for example, that the book talks about. So, it's an interesting stage for the kids. So Kohlberg's moral development, forgive me, I always mix up Piaget and Kohlberg. But Kohlberg's moral development also occurs during this time. Again, pre-conventional, before age 6, children are aware of the consequences. But conventional, they start to really become aware of the authority. And then post-conventional, they do not have this. This is the universal principles, like big macro ethical questions. But about this age, they start to focus on how situational outcomes impact others and wanting to please and be accepted. And so I opened up this conversation talking about this age, about how children at this time just, really want to be accepted. They are really good and kind and sweet. And again, why is this? Like, again, they care about being accepted. They want people to like them. They want to please other people. And so again, they're going through this stage. They're aware of authority and they learn to follow authority. And then they tend to internalize the cultural norms of the authority, for example. But again, they haven't really developed that universal ethics like we have. And then this chapter concludes with gender development. I'm going to put in I put in a couple other videos on gender and sexuality that are much more extensive, because I don't want you to sit here all day with just this one specifically. But just a quick run through with gender. It's a big debate about when gender identity really solidifies, but if you really delve into the research, by about age 5, a child's gender is pretty well solidified. Now, again, gender is something that constantly is evolving throughout the lifespan. By about our mid-20s, the differences between genders are like the highest in their mid-20s. And then by like the time we're old, these gender differences pretty much just go away again. So again, why does gender occur? Why do we diversify into genders? Why do we stratify society into genders? How much of that's just to cover labor? How much of it's, hierarchical conflict and, social stratification? Again, it's a broad concept, but it is interesting that by about age 5, kids have pretty much solidified their gender. But so again, how does this process happen is super complex. So I always take a biopsychosocial approach to it. Again, there are some basic physical differences between our bodies when it comes to gonads, hormones, genitalia, chromosomes. It gets very complex because there are some people that are born with a vagina and breasts and ovaries, but they have really high levels of testosterone. So does that influence their identity and their gender categorization, for example? You have men that have a penis, but also have a womb. Again, how does that influence their gender development? It's super complex. But again, there are some physical processes that play out in our decisions as to how we label ourselves within these socially constructed categories. However, I like to ask the question, if there were no social categories, would we even label ourselves in the first place? Because the book is pretty clear that even though there are some physical differences, when it comes to actual differences between people, like gender is just not really a factor. Like males, females, people of all gender are pretty much the same. Like we just aren't that different. Like we want to think we're all that different, but we're not that different. So, I mean, it's in the book, I will not say anything that's not somewhere in some research, okay? But again, the biology of it all is that. How do these biological factors influence our identification with socially constructed gender categories? The psychology of it all is our reflecting on the way we feel and our cognitions and our observations, and how do those interplay for us to make decisions about what gender category we're in. And then the social construction approach is that gender categories are socially constructed by us. It's us who makes the categories and determine the attributes attached to these categories. And then we label people as belonging to these categories. And then we socialize you differently based upon the category you belong to, which then creates gender differences between people. Again, if we socialize people all the same, you wouldn't see really any gender differences. That might be heretical to say out loud, but again, how much do these slight biological differences affect actual behavior in the social context is a great nature-nurture debate. All right. Biological sex, again, is your chromosomes, gonads, genitalia, hormones. All of those things have to be considered to define a biological sex. And again, we'll talk about that in a second. Gender then is either you're socially being labeled as belonging to a category, or your own personal gender identity and your self-selection of a gender category that you belong to. How many sexes are there? The answer is a minimum of 3, potentially over 100, because there is male, female, and then intersex, which again is typically defined as ambiguous chromosomes, genitalia, hormones, chromosomes. Okay, a doctor can't necessarily identify it as some binary one or the other. And the book says 0.6 to 3% are people. Oh no, that's for gender. About 2% of the world, 1 to 2%, is intersex. Again, these people that have maybe a penis and ovaries, for example. It's super complex. And why does that exist in our DNA, that 1 to 2% of people have ambiguous chromosomes, genitalia, gonads, and hormones, for example? That could go back to sex differentiation from way back in the sea when we were sharks and we went from hermaphroditic and then decided to do the male-female thing. Again, there's 2 ways to make babies. You can either split your cells or you can demix your cells with something else. And so again, if you go back millions of years and study sharks and the beginning of sex differentiation, again, I have some other lecture videos on this that I'm going to put up there. But again, it's super complex. So at least 3 is the answer for how many sexes. And then how many genders are there? Infinite. It's us who creates the categories. We can just keep making them. We can deconstruct them, whatever. I mean, I just lost track of how many genders there are. So that's basically where I'm at with gender. Gender dysphoria is a psychological disorder where you experience psychological distress due to the disparity between your assigned gender at birth and the gender that you identify with. And the question of that is how much of that's an internal process and how much of that results from just conflict in the social context that you're not able to actually be who you are as a person. Sexual orientation is just, again, determined as your preference maybe for a category, but sexual orientation, in my words, is, all humans have the potential to engage in a diverse sexual acts. Some can be labeled as positive, some absolutely evil. Like humans unchecked will have sex with animals, will have sex with children, will rape people. Okay, so again, sexuality is ridiculously complex, but the labeling of your sexuality with a specific orientation, again, is a social construct. It's us who comes up with these words to, for these categories that we created. Instead of just being sexual people, at some point in history, we came up with some categories to label that. And then at some point, we came up with some norms to structure sexuality. And so again, our sexuality is highly regulated in the social context for good reasons. At least some of it. We need to regulate against rape to protect women and children and rape of men. We need to protect against animals for the vast millions of consequences that happen as a result of that. But, other social norms regarding sexuality, they are always in flux. In some cultures, homosexuality is normal. Ancient Japan, Alexander the Great. I mean, it's just Sparta. It's just common. And in other countries, it's other times and other epochs, it's absolutely taboo. And then, so again, it just depending upon your time in history dictates whether it's culturally acceptable, yada, yada, yada. Gender stereotyping, again, once you get labeled into a category, we then structure your behavior so that you meet the expectations of the social roles dictated by the gender group that you are told you belong to. Contained in those attributes, those stereotypes, that's what you're living up to. Once you find out you are a female, what do? Do you model, imitate, and mimic the behavior of females? Or, you know what I mean? And so again, we tend to model the behavior or internalize the culture of the groups that we belong to. So if you're told your whole life you're female, then you internalize the culture of being female, for example. But those stereotyping has a huge effect on our personality, because again, if we socialize someone to be female, and then we socialize them to embrace the attributes of what we socially determine are female traits, is that why girls are sweeter, nicer, kinder, less aggressive? Or is that a biological trait? And so again, your book talks about sex and gender differences. Like, boys tend to be a little bit more active. Girls tend to be a little bit more developed with verbal skills, and they do it younger too. Boys tend to be a little bit better at visuospatial skills, like hitting baseballs and reading maps. And how much that's biology and how much that's learned is the question. Girls tend to be way more verbally aggressive when they get older, but boys tend to be more physically aggressive when they get older. Self-regulation, girls tend to be better at this, along with pro-social behavior also. Boys tend to suffer more from developmental vulnerabilities. So again, it's kind of a toss-up. And if you look at some of the biological differences in like gray matter in the brain or hormone levels in the brain, and how much does this affect things like the way we feel and then label ourselves with the gender, it's really complex. So again, I'm attaching a couple other videos on that just so you guys can get more if you're interested in that, or I would be here for days. I mean, I've studied gender and sexuality for my doctorate for years, and I'm just constantly learning. But again, your book talks about psychological androgyny. And again, I asked, are we all this? I mean, how different are people really? Again, the idea that we become so much more similar as we get old. Why? It's because, again, because we just stop caring. It doesn't matter who does what as much when we're old. Maybe that's just a theory. And then some theories of gender development, just real quick. You have social learning theory, like Bandura's theory, where we observe, we figure out what groups we belong to, and then we act and mold our behavior and our personality to conform to that group's cultural way of life. There's biological and neurophysical. Again, thinking about how much your biological processes play a role, like your levels of hormones, and the neurophysiological, looking at the structure of the brain, like gray matter, and why are boys better at visual spatial skills? Is that because that part of the brain is more developed for boys, and girls are better with emotional intelligence because that part of the brain is more developed? Or is that part of the brain more developed because we teach boys to hit bats and we teach girls to like work in groups and talk better? And so again, we always have to ask those questions. Cognitive theory, again, using your cognitions, your, thinking about things, perceptions, reflection, asking yourself, who am I? Who do I want to be? How do I become that person? Gender schema theory, that our brain naturally organizes and codes information. And so we code cultural information into schemas, and then we use language, words, to be like the label for the schema, but we get those words from the social context, and then we organize that into our brain's file system of memories. Then you have dynamic systems theories, looking at the social context, like systems of gender stratification, dividing into groups, dividing into social roles. How does that structure our behavior? Intersectional factors like race and ethnicity, sexuality that play a role here. And then overall status hierarchies. Does gender exist to stratify society into males and females? Did males do this so that they could have male domination for thousands of years, only to be overturned kind of during civil rights, but women are still starting to fight back, for example? So again, does gender serve those in power? Does it maintain the status quo by women continuing to be women and men continue to be men without as androgynous overlap? Does that maintain the status power dynamics where men have had power for thousands of years? Questions to be asked. Okay, please see my other videos for a much more extensive development conversation on gender. But again, by about 5, it pretty much is solidified. Why? Again, because by 5, we've absorbed a lot of information from the social context. Okay, y'all, have a wonderful day.